That's great. Many thanks, Oliver, just for that oversight and introduction. Very useful. So what I'd like to do next then is just start to talk a little bit more about the process. As Oliver said, our role is often to take people from the point where they've had maybe a little bit of an idea or a thought that perhaps employee ownership is something that they could be interested in, right the way through the transaction process to implementation. There's various steps and stages involved in that, so we're just going to sort of touch on those themes as we go through this next aspect of the presentation. So I've just sort of summarized each of those points on this slide here, and on the right hand side just tried to allude to the level of employee engagement that you might have as you sort of work through the various stages, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail as we go through. So as Oliver quite rightly said in his summary, employee ownership typically is sort of looking at more the SMEs, and certainly that's what we're seeing in the transactions that we're involved in. But it is sector agnostic. There's no particular sort of rights or wrongs in terms of which sectors this should apply to. And very much when we're talking to clients about succession of a business, then we like to have it on the table as one of the options. It's not the only option. As we've alluded to here, there's the traditional sort of trade sale, selling out to another business, the institutional buyout, so perhaps a sort of private equity backed purchase, management buyouts. All these things are potential avenues for succession of a business, and EOT rightly should be considered alongside them all. But I think it is important that whilst there's no particular sectors that are excluded or size of businesses necessarily, the EOTs aren't necessarily a one-size-fits-all sort of methodology. And we certainly wouldn't be sat here trying to sort of shoehorn any business into employee ownership. I think one of the most important factors is that at the outset, the existing business right now needs to have the right sort of culture. And the owners, the current owners that are selling, have to have the right ethos to ensure that an employee ownership trust is the sort of right and most suitable option. So we'll sort of carefully explore each of those options and the pros and cons with the exiting shareholders. And at this point, as the graphic on the left-hand side suggests, is that really the level of employee engagement right now is probably going to be relatively low. We are just simply sort of talking to the shareholders, most likely confidentially at this point, as we just explore the various options open to them. But let's make the assumption now then that we have gone through all that, and employee ownership is definitely the desired route forward and deemed to be the most appropriate. So at this point, then we have this slightly sort of unusual dynamic in that we've got a set of selling shareholders that are going to sell their business to an employee ownership trust, which at this point has actually yet to be created. And even once it is created, that will only be done right at the very end of the transaction. So unlike most other sort of forms of sale or purchase, where you have sort of two competing sides to the negotiations, a buyer and a seller, we don't have that natural sort of tension that exists within those negotiations. So the valuation is clearly an extremely important aspect of the deal itself. So that's where someone like ourselves at Horsons would come in and perform an independent valuation of the business. And the key here is what we've put on this first bullet point, is that what we're trying to establish is the fair market value. So obviously that will come through our own sort of expertise, knowledge of the market, knowledge of the business, and we will have to make an assessment of that. Discuss that with the selling shareholders. A common approach to valuation, albeit it's not the only approach, is that it may end up being some sort of multiple of the profitability of the business, which is then adjusted for either the net cash or the net debt within the business. What I will say is that I could probably talk all morning about sort of valuation methodology and how we go about that, but that's not what we're here to do today particularly. So I'll move pretty swiftly on from that aspect. But let's just assume again that valuation has been performed. At this stage, we also need to think about how we might complete a transaction. Again, there's a lot of sort of detail that we can speak around what we call here the closing mechanism, various ways to do that, but just a technical way in which that we actually determine the very final price that is to be paid. The only comment I would probably make on that at this stage is that typically with employee ownership transactions, we like to try and keep things relatively simple if we can, avoid overly complicating matters and ultimately try and keep costs down as well. So something like a fixed price transaction or potentially a lockbox transaction is arguably a little bit more common, a little bit more popular on employee ownership transactions versus something like completion accounts. And the final bullet point that we've just got on this slide about the whole principle here, the whole ethos being that the transaction is ultimately to be for the benefit of the employees, really that has to be manifested within the valuation itself. This is definitely not an exercise in trying to get away with, let's say, the highest possible valuation that a seller can try and sort of justify. We're definitely looking for that very principle of fair market value. It needs to be balanced.